Do not hurry as you walk with grief. It does not help the journey. Walk slowly, pausing often. Do not hurry as you walk with grief. Do not be disturbed by memories that come unbidden. Swiftly forgive and let Christ speak for you unspoken words. Unfinished conversations will be resolved in Him. Be not disturbed. Be gentle with one who walks with grief. If it is you, be gentle with yourself. Swiftly forgive. Walk slowly, pausing often. Take time and be gentle as you walk with grief. Those words from the Northumbria community's Celtic Prayers for Daily Living have helped me over many years as I have tried to progress and work my way through grief, sadness, sorrow, and heartbreak. As I come to this seminar to talk to you and share with you about grief and loss and sadness, there's part of me wishes that I didn't have to do it, that somehow we could avoid the topic and run away from it. But I think that's what many Christians tend to do, and I'm not sure that it helps us. We either sugarcoat grief and turn it into something that we have minimized and turned into something that isn't important, or we are consumed by it, but rarely do we face it head on and allow the Christian truth of hope and resurrection to guide us through the sorrow and the sadness that we face. My understanding of this subject has been formed in the dark womb of personal trial and loss. I come to this seminar as a pastor, as a public theologian, and as a missiologist, trying to help people around me in my local community of faith, in my wider community, and in the nation think about and reflect on what it means to grieve well, to give ourselves time to weep, to be sad, to deal with loss. And I guess there's a sense in which this subject has not been as important as it is now for many, many decades, not only in the United Kingdom, but around the world. I had no idea back last year in 2019, when I wrote Good Grief, that it would be published just days into the lockdown and all the things that are happening around the United Kingdom and around the world. But as a pastor, I have to find out ways of helping and supporting people through their sadness and their loss. And that's now more important than it has ever been. As a public theologian, it's my job to think about how grief and sadness and sorrow and heartbreak and despair weave their way into the fabric of society and into the way of our lives, and what the Christian response is to that. As a missiologist, I want to think about how we handle grief and sadness and allow people to see God somewhere in the midst of the chaos and the darkness. But I don't just come to this subject as those three public offices. I come as a son who has lost his parents. My dad died suddenly and unexpectedly in 2002. My mum in 2016 after heartbreak after heartbreak. I come as a brother. My brother died in 2016 as well. My brother-in-law died in 2015. My nephew, I come as an uncle, died in 2014. I come as a husband who has, with his wife, lost a child and watched our son and daughter-in-law lose a child. I come as a friend who has had to bury folk that are very close to me. And I guess, like many of you that are watching the seminar, I come with my own story of grief, my own story of sadness and of loss and of heartbreak and of pain. Of course, grief comes in many ways and in many forms to us. Sometimes it's through the loss of a loved one. Sometimes it's through the disappointment of something that we longed for very much and it didn't happen. Not being able to have children. Not being able to do the things that God has called us to do. Grief comes to us through sadness, through sorrow, through heartbreak, through redundancy, through the loss of a reputation, the loss of a future, the loss of a story that we thought we were going to enjoy. Whatever way it comes to us, it does come to us. And you and I, at some point or another, will have to navigate the straits of sorrow and of heartbreak and of loss. We'll have to work out how we respond. And I'm not sure that some of the cliches that we hear from around us, you'll get through this, you'll get over it. You know, death is a friend that you have to welcome. I'm not sure any of those are true. And actually, I think some of them really are very deeply unhelpful. I think in some aspects, in some traditions of the church, some corners of the church, we run away from grief with our theology, always claiming that God will put everything right immediately, that we won't go through heartbreak or sadness or sorrow. No more evident than even in the current crisis, where lots of people are praying for protection. I'm praying for protection for my family and for my church and so forth. But to assume that that therefore means that no Christian will go through sorrow or heartbreak or pain is simply both unwise, unhelpful, and thirdly, I would suggest deeply unbiblical. The thoughts that I'm going to bring you in this seminar are partial thoughts, because nobody has a complete story or a complete handle on what it means to walk through this heartbreak and pain. They're incomplete. They are my own journey's reflections. They are some of the ways in which I have sought to make sense of my own sorrow, my own loss, and my own pain. But they're also ways in which I've sought to help others. I've sought to think theologically and biblically about this. So Good Grief is not my self-help manual on a tape. Instead, it is my attempt to help you and anyone who is grieving and going through heartbreak and pain to work out what that looks like and to begin to think about what it might mean to navigate our way through the passages that we don't want to make, the journeys that we don't want to have to embark upon. The valleys and the shadows and the unknownness of it all can be all-consuming. So I offer my thoughts to you over the next 20 minutes or so as partial thoughts. They are taken from my book, which I am grateful to God is helping many, many people. As I try to understand grief in my own life, as I try to navigate it, I realise something that is often overlooked. I think in my own journey, it is my struggle with sadness and with loss and with heartbreak and with pain that has perhaps been one of the greatest witnesses, one of the greatest moments that God has used to demonstrate his grace and his love and his mercy to other people. Certainly as a pastor, that's also been true. As our church that I navigate and lead here in Northern Ireland and the one that I led previously in Buckinghamshire had to walk through sorrow and sadness and loss, we've discovered that God was at work in a profound way that we couldn't understand. And the way in which he used it to draw people onto himself was both amazing and profound. You see, I think the starting point for all of us is to recognise that sorrow and loss and suffering are part of life. And if they're an unavoidable part of life, then they are an unavoidable part of faith. It isn't a weakness or a failure. It isn't an admittance of despair or hopelessness to say that you struggle with grief. It isn't throwing up your hands and just in surrender and saying there's nothing I can do about this. Instead, if we learn to navigate grief, if we find some ways of addressing it and thinking about it in our own lives, in the lives of those that we love, in our communities, then we will discover something that can give us hope. We'll discover a pathway, although we may not choose it, that can deepen our faith and make us realise more profoundly God's grace and God's goodness. You see, as a pastor, I have discovered something that we often don't talk about, but I think it's important. Over 30 years of pastoring, I have helped, pastored, supported, sought to encourage many people through grief and loss of one kind or another. And I've seen many draw closer to God. I've seen many discover a depth of God's grace and closeness and mercy to them that has been beautiful and profound. But I've also seen many walk away from God. Grief doesn't automatically draw us closer in our faith. Grief doesn't automatically make sense to us. It isn't like it all falls into place when we're walking through sadness and sorrow and loss. Instead, we have choices that we have to make in response to grief. in response to its presence in our lives, in response to what it does to us and how we allow it to shape us or change us, and what we do in response back. I think we can grow. I think we can come closer to God. But I also think that we can walk away from God. We can blame him. We can get angry at him and leave the blame and leave the anger. So as we think about what that might mean for you and for me, my prayer is that God will draw us in and help us realize that in the midst of grief and sadness, he is present. This seminar is being premiered at Spring Harvest for Home at home. And I think that our country is going through a sadness and a sorrow. The world is going through a sadness and a sorrow that none of us expected even 6 months ago. And all around us, people will have lost loved ones. They'll not have been able to attend funerals. They'll have been trying to work out how they can manage the sadness and the loss in their lives, in their families' lives, in their communities' lives, in their churches' lives, and in the nation's life. Replicate that over country after country after country, and it's an important thing for us to think about how we cope with loss, the suddenness of it, the unexpectedness of it, the anger that it creates in us, the uncertainty that it opens up in our souls. So I pray that my thoughts will help you as we try to answer the question, how do we help one another through the grief journey? How can God help me through the grief journey? How does he help us with our fear, our anxiety, our questions, our anger, our guilt? All of those things are present in the grief journey. And yet we can find hope in it. We can find a way through. We can find the strength to carry on. I think we're failing as pastors and we are failing as Christian communities if we paint a picture of life that avoids grief and loss. And I think that we are giving hope to people. We are demonstrating that survival is possible if we navigate grief and loss in a way that is authentic, honest, open, vulnerable, and invites those around us into the space and gives God space and room to speak into our own lives and into our own hearts. I have been changed by sorrow and loss. I see the world very differently now than I did 6 or 7 years ago. I hear music differently. I see colour differently. Time feels different. Friendships, conversations, moments with family are different. And my faith is different. It is simpler. I believe that God is good and his love endures forever. And the grief journey has taught me that I don't have to understand him to trust him. My wife has held me as I've cried myself to sleep at night. Sometimes I've cried through the night. There are days when I thought I couldn't stop crying, when I thought that my life was going to be consumed by sorrow and loss and that I wasn't going to make it. I was unable to think straight for months. My memory went, my sleep pattern destroyed, my temper all over the place. I became very quiet, withdrawn. Debbie, my wife, believes that I fell into depression. I probably did. I would look at other people and not be able to enter into conversations. Grief does that to you. It can destroy you. It can eat away at you. And how we handle it, how we respond to it is so important. I guess many of you know what I'm talking about because you've gone through this pain and this heartbreak and this sorrow yourselves. Many of you are going through it now. I want to offer you just a few thoughts about grief and loss, and I pray that they help. Grief has brought out in me my deepest convictions. It has shown me what I really believe about God, and it's shown me what has been frivolous about my belief. It's challenged my words to others. It's changed the way I listen to other people's heartbreaks and stories. It's shown me some of my strengths, a simple childlike faith, an ability to be thankful in the most difficult circumstances, the reflective aspect of my life, the quiet aspect of my life, the rhythm of waiting on God, the reliance that I have on the Bible, my belief in the presence of the Holy Spirit, my conviction that God comforts us and carries us. These are some of the strengths that God has brought to the surface through grief. But it's also been a journey that has shown some of my weaknesses. Some of my theology has had to be corrected. Some of my compassion has had to be deepened. Some of my ideas about myself and others have had to be changed. Some of my ideas about healing. My convictions around what it means that God heals sometimes rather than God heals all the time. A real theology for real life. A desire to engage with people where they are rather than in some kind of utopian world. God has challenged and deepened and strengthened my faith, but he has also cut at it. And he's made me realise that the priorities that I need to set are important around family time, spending time with him, spending time with people that I love, valuing those in front of me, telling people that I love them as often as I can, investing in memories so that they are there, dealing with practical arrangements for my own death or my wife's death if something should happen to us. All of these are things that have happened to me and in me as a consequence of the grief journey. And the tears that I've shed, I don't think are a sign of weakness. I don't think that they are a sign of fear or anxiety. I think when you and I shed tears in grief, they are evidence of our love of the people that we have lost. They're evidence of strength. To truly break your heart in God's presence and feel as if you're never going to be able to get over that is a moment when God steps in and does something in you, and you realise that the hands that hold us through this heartbreak and pain, even when we cannot feel them, are so profoundly important, and they help us remarkably. God is present now as we think and reflect on grief, where you are, where I am, and he'll be present in the days and the weeks and the months that lie ahead. And if you have lost someone, you may not feel him, that's okay. You may not sense him, that's okay. That's also part of the grief process itself. Our emotions are numbed. We become so raw that we run out of ways of expressing how we feel. None of that means that God is absent or that he's gone. In fact, I think one of the things that a good grief journey realises is a sense of absence is actually proof of a presence that we once enjoyed. And a sense of the absence of God is evidence of his presence that we once cherished. And the absence that we feel about those that we've loved is evidence of the love that we had for them. And it is profoundly and deeply important. Grief isn't the end of your story. It's part of your story. Your fear, your anxiety, all those feelings that come with grief. C.S. Lewis said he never realised that grief felt so much like fear. Some people describe grief as concussion, or being strangled, or a deep anxiety sitting upon us. I think I've experienced all of those. And if somebody doesn't give you permission or tell you that that's okay, you can feel as if you're losing your mind or that you're coping really badly. But anger, fear, not being able to breathe, not being able to concentrate, sleeplessness, not being able to pray, not being able to read, not being able to talk about it, withdrawal, they're all aspects of the grief journey that are normal, that are part of any grief process. Grief comes with many faces and many forms, and my journey isn't yours and your journey isn't your friends. Even when we've lost a single family member, we all relate to that family member differently when we're in a time of grief or loss. I guess we have to allow ourselves space and time to be us. And if you're trying to help somebody through grief, give them space. Allow them to be themselves. Don't smother them. Don't do everything for them. Listen when you need to. Be silent when you need to. Say something when you have to. But do something. Don't walk away from them. Don't withdraw from them because of a fear that you don't know what to say. Just say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. And I love you, and I'm going to walk with you, and I'll do whatever I can to help. I think the ways in which we help and support other people are so important, and just giving ourselves space and time to recognise our own grief pathway and to walk through it honestly and with authenticity is profoundly and deeply important. There's an Asian poem that is in a temple in Asia that a friend of mine told me about some years ago, and it is about grief and sorrow and loss. And the poem has 3 words, but 2 of them are scored out and the only one that remains is loss. Because sometimes we don't have words to express how we're feeling. And all that is left is loss. All that is left is the emotion of trying to cope with what we're going through. That's okay. God sees and knows that. There are some biblical images that I think can help us with grief and loss. One of the most profound is the idea of walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And that imagery taken from Psalm 23 is powerful. It gives us pictures of darkness, of shadows, of journeys, of uncertainty, of trying to navigate our way through valleys. Let me read Psalm 23 verse 4 to you from the New Revised Standard Version. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Or even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, your rod and staff comfort me, and I fear no evil. Job in his story had a profound sense of this sadness as well. In Job chapter 16 verse 16, he describes himself as facing great darkness. He says this, my face is red with weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids. That idea of darkness and despair is a very prevalent idea in the Bible. It is scattered across Scripture in lots of different ways. And darkness and despair and valleys and shadows are a helpful image for us to stay with for a few moments as we work out where we are. Because some of you will feel as if you're in a dark valley, that you're walking through uncertainty, and that there are shadows all around you lurking and dancing in the night. You'll feel sleepless, you'll feel anxious, you'll feel uncertain, and you will need something to help you through. Psalm 107 verses 10 to 14 talk about darkness as well. We read these words. Some sat in darkness and in gloom, prisoners in misery and in irons, for they had rebelled against the words of God and spurned the counsel of the Most High. Their hearts were bowed down with hard labour. They fell down with no one to help. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he saved them from their distress. He brought them out of darkness and gloom. Psalm 139 in verses 11 and 12 also say something about darkness and valleys and shadows. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me and the light around me become night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. Understanding our grief and our despair as darkness, as a valley, as a shadow that we must walk through, as a period of uncertainty is not a bad thing. We can be helped as we walk through those places. You see, with life comes death, with light comes darkness. It's an inevitable part of this journey that we have to navigate our way through. And as I have tried to work out my own journey through grief and loss, I've discovered that God can help in the midst of all of that he can bring comfort and peace and courage even in the darkness, because he sits with me in the darkness. He does something in me in the darkness and in the shadows that he can only do in the darkness and shadows. He can't do it in the light. Some sat in darkness and God set them free, the psalm says that I just read to you. God comes to us in the darkness. He sits with us in the darkness, even when we can't see him, even when we can't feel him. He is there. And darkness and shadows are not permanent things. They come and they go. Shadows change and shift depending on the light. And our despair and our sadness is not a permanent dwelling place. God can use them to change us. I don't necessarily think that means that they are gifts to us. But if we can bring our sadness and our sorrow to God, if we can bring our sense of shadow and isolation and loneliness and walking through a valley to God, we discover things about ourselves and about God which are beautiful and moving, that he sits with us, that he encounters us. Darkness in Scripture is not just a place of despair, it's a place of encounter. Moses encountered God in darkness. The day of the Lord is described as a day of darkness. There is a moment in darkness where we can encounter God, where he can reach into our hearts and souls and give us hope and courage. But we must journey through it. We must navigate this valley. The idea of valleys in the Bible are very clear. They are valleys of tears, like in one of the Psalms. They're valleys of encounter. They're valleys of battle. They're valleys of victory. They're valleys of reflection. But if we can approach grief and sadness and recognize that we are entering a valley where it will feel dark, it will feel uncertain, and it will feel despairing, but we can meet with God in it, then something changes profoundly in how we handle it and how we deal with it. There's one example of that for me, which is particularly powerful, that I want to share with you. It is the week after Easter. And I want to reflect with you just on two passages from the Gospels about Jesus as he dies on the cross. The first is Matthew chapter 27, verses 45 and 46. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? The second passage is in Luke chapter 23, from verses 44 to 47, talking about the same moments. It was now about noon, and the darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. Those two passages talk about the same moment, and yet we have Christ crying two things. My God, why have you forsaken me? And into your hands I commend my spirit. It is possible in the valley of grief to feel heartbroken and abandoned and call out to God at the same time. There's no paradox in having faith with tears in our eyes, in saying to God, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. In coming to him with all of our uncertainty, all of our shadows, all of our sadness and all of our despair. God meets with us in the midst of it, and perhaps just giving ourselves space and time to acknowledge that is a beginning of a journey for us into a place of much deeper hope. What's interesting is the little phrase that's translated the valley of the shadow of death in Psalm 23 in Hebrew is Tsal Mavet, and it's a very difficult passage to translate. Tsal means valley, Mavet means death. Some Bibles translate it as valley of the shadow of death. Some translate it as a valley of deep darkness. Some translate it as a valley of trouble. But the verse that I read to you from Psalm 23 verse 4 is very famous. Even when I pass through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. What is less known is the verse that I read to you from Job. My face is red with weeping and deep darkness is on my eyelids. Well, that deep darkness is also Sal Mavet. It's the same Hebrew phrase. So what Job says is, my face is red with weeping and the valley of the shadow of death rests on my eyes. If you've gone through sorrow and loss, you know what that feels like. That sense of a deep valley and shadow resting on us. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing to run away from. Nothing to live in either. But instead to realise that God is with us in that deep and profound valley and that he will carry us is incredibly important. God can encounter us in the shadow. He can lift us up in the shadow. He can draw us toward himself in the shadow. But we have to give him time to do that. And we need some pictures, some metaphors and some images, some pathways and journeys that can help us to deal with grief and loss more helpfully. There is such a thing as good grief. But it involves challenging some of the assumptions that our culture makes and our church makes. And it involves allowing ourselves to be honest, getting the help and the support that we need. Talking, listening, praying, weeping, laughing, crying together. For me, there are a number of images that I explore in good grief that I think are helpful, but they're not often looked at. Death isn't a friend. Death is a squatter. It's like you go away and come home and somebody has broken into your house. That's not something we are called to get used to. We have to work out how we get this squatter and deal with them effectively. How we allow ourselves to be angry, allow ourselves to be honest. And Christian cliches and panaceas are not going to help. There's a stage in grief where we just have to be allowed to say, I hate what's happening to me. I'm angry with it. And if you're a friend of somebody who's grieving, allow them to be angry, allow them to be honest, give them space to be vulnerable. Don't tell them what to think. Don't tell them how to feel. Don't tell them they've got to get over it in 6 months. Don't tell them they'll get through it. Give them the space to be honest about their feelings, their emotions. Our nation is going to need that. Our community is going to need it. Our neighbourhoods are going to need it. And our churches are going to need it. And you might need permission to recognise that this isn't the natural space for us to live in. We hate death. We resist it. We fight against it because we were made for life. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that the final enemy to be conquered is death, and that Christ has conquered it. He's gone through it and out the other side, but we're still this side of it. So we do get angry, we do get confused, we do get pent up, and we need space to be honest about that. Secondly, I think we need to be allowed to recognise that time stands still when we're going through grief and loss. It can feel like we are trapped in a time warp. We don't understand why the world hasn't stopped. In the famous words of W.H. Auden's poem, we want everything to stop around us because the person that we loved has died, and coping with the fact that it doesn't is really difficult. So by helping somebody who's grieving to be honest about that and to talk about the frustration of that, and for you and me to give them time that we will stop, we will listen, we will be the space that pays attention to what they're going through is helpful. And giving ourselves the space to stop is so important too. Taking time, as I said at the beginning, to walk slowly with grief and pause often and recognise that our unfinished conversations can be finished in God. Thirdly, I think recognising that grief is a jumbled journey. It comes to us in different spaces. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief is a very helpful image, but I think it can too often be turned into this idea that we go through stage 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and it's done. That's not how I've experienced grief. Grief has been seasonal to me. There's a winterness about it when everything feels hard and cold. But in the winter, roots are going down. There's an autumn in it when we feel as if we're losing something, but something is being stripped back so that something beautiful can grow. There's a spring to it when we see what we can learn out of grief beginning to push through the soil of our lives. And there's a summer to it where we recognise the gifts that we've once had of people or situations that we may have lost, and we enjoy them again through memory. But instead of going through one season and then the next, then the next, then the next in order, we bounce about and allowing ourselves to be jumbled up, being honest and giving people space to recognise that the jumbledness in their heads or in their lives is okay, is such a helpful part of the journey as we navigate through grief. But holding on to hope in the middle of it, believing that the sap will rise, that death and sadness and loss and grief are not the end of our story, are profoundly important principles. Christians believe in resurrection. We believe that Jesus has the last word and death doesn't. We live this side of death. Christ has gone through death and come back to us. And sometimes it's hard to remember that. But holding on to the fact that the physical, the present, is not the end of the story is deeply helpful. And giving ourselves space and time to remember the hope that God gives us in each day is profoundly important. Learning to live with life in a major and a minor key. Sometimes it sounds joyful and happy, but sometimes our lives feel like lament. They feel like uncertainty. They feel like the deeper minor keys. And we have to give ourselves permission to do that. Our churches aren't good at that. And often our friendships aren't good at that. But we need to learn to live in both the major key of celebration and the minor key of loss, and let the cadence of grief engulf us. And actually, as a result, our worlds and our lives become deeper and more beautiful. But it is difficult to live life in 2 keys, moving from one to the other and back again. But it's the only way to navigate the struggles and the heartbreaks that we feel, I think. And lastly, what I would say to you, and I would encourage you to reflect on Jesus' resurrection of Lazarus for this. I don't have time to go into it in this seminar. I'm going to be posting some other things about grief online. Is that Christ has conquered death. He is the resurrection and the life. We don't have to live in death. We don't have to be consumed by it. We go through it and out the other side. Our loved ones go through it and out the other side. Christ has conquered it. But it doesn't mean that we're not heartbroken. We're not bereft. We don't have to reimagine our lives. Many of us have had futures that we thought we were going to have taken away from us. In order to come to terms with the future that we now have, we need to grieve the future that we have lost. We need to be given space and time to be honest about our sadness and our loss. But in the end, Christ is enough. God is enough. Death can reprioritize us. It can draw us closer. It can transform the way we think. And my prayer for you today is that you will encounter the grace, the mercy and the comfort of God. And that if you are walking through grief, you will be comforted and given hope. And if you're walking with somebody through grief, that you will help them. And I end where I began. Do not hurry as you walk with grief. It does not help the journey. Walk slowly, pausing often. Amen.